Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my Jazz Legacy album series, number 5, I believe it is. We've done some Cannonball, some Miles, some Mingus, and some Mobley. Today we're going to talk about Art Pepper. And I've been off and on about Art Pepper over the years. I've always kind of sided with the East Coast guys for the most part. However, Pepper's a legend in and of his own self, and a legend of the West Coast sound, and really some of his records define cool as good as anything else I can illustrate for you. The laid back tempos, the soft, pillowy tone of his alto sax. Uh, Sadly, Art Pepper, the person, muddies the waters some. I guess he had quite a habit. I think he spent a little time in jail, if our memory serves. He was quite unreliable, it sounds like. It's amazing how many of the white cats on the West Coast got junked up. It's the pressures and stressors of being a white jazz player on the West Coast isn't the same as what it was for Charles Parker. And yet the heroin seemed to take just as strong a foothold in the white community as it did in the black community out east. And East Coast, West Coast, it is kind of a racial thing. It's not to say there wasn't great white East Coast players, and it's not to say there wasn't great black West Coast players like Mingus and Dolphy, Buddy Collette. And to be fair, most of the great West Coast players that are white come from the East Coast, places like Philadelphia and Cleveland, and a whole myriad of East Coast cities. And they all went to the West Coast, in part looking for work, in part because there was a westward expansion happening in the country to begin with. And being a historian, it's important to remember America. These are the post-war years. And America became incredibly prosperous post-war. And there was a boom that happens economically that was, well, let's just say it was sustained, because the boom really starts during the war. That's kind of what brings us out of the Depression in most senses. The war manufacturing was such a vital economic turn, and it really creates a position of wealth and power, and we can bargain and make ourselves find a sense of control globally with weapons and now debt. And so Americans were kind of living on the edge of that bubble, at least white Americans were. And part of the great post-war movement was moving south for white Americans, kind of the opposite of where the blacks had come from. The whites start moving down that way to places like Atlanta, Florida. And then they start moving out west in great numbers. And a big part of that was the introduction of the interstate highway system, which, if you're not from America, it's similar to the A1 series in the United Kingdom or the Autobahn in Germany. These broad 4-lane highways designed to be taken 100 miles an hour. They were designed, actually, also to be limited access for, in case of invasion during the Cold War. They were meant to be for military distribution of personnel and weapons and shut off to the public. And that was part of how they got through Congress. And of course, the Cold War came out of the Second World War as a way to sustain that economic growth. But you can't just shut the faucet off and think you're going to keep having a rosy picture. So you need to sustain military spending and expenditure and the fear culture. And the Cold War was exactly that. And it's played out the last 6 years as the dominant domino in global affairs. That post-war American expansionism, the capitalist growth, destroying its competitor, the social communists. But the Americans that are in the East haven't really embraced the black migration, and that's obvious. And the white flight, we often talk about it in context of the whites moving to the suburbs of the city that they were once living in. So you move to the suburbs of Philly, the suburbs of Queens and Long Island, if you're a New Yorker, moving from Cleveland maybe to Akron, onto some of the hinterlands, getting away from that urbanism and that minority influx that was so uncomfortable to you for your children going to school. But the other option was for a lot of white Americans just to pack up and move out to the West Coast. And the film industry had done that in the 30s. And so America had gotten used to the sunshine of Hollywood, the nice weather all the time. And for the film industry, it was a big boon being in LA because the weather's the same almost every day, which allows for continuity when you're reshooting scenes. If you're in New York and you shoot a scene on a gray, rainy day, you got to wait for that next gray, rainy day to come to reshoot that or to add something to it, just to retake it. So Hollywood was a really attractive place for the weather and the jobs that were being created by Hollywood. And of course, the music scene, vice, music, drugs, prostitution, always follows wealth. And so the jazz musicians flocked out to the West Coast because the nightclubs were now being filled and there was demand for work, demand for jazz musicians to play. And white musicians filled most of those jobs. And again, they developed their own sense of sound on the West Coast, which became known as the West Coast Cool. And I think very deceptively, the birth of the Cool is often linked as one of the initial cool records, but it's really not a cool record in any way. It's a very much a modern compositional record. It's got some third stream elements, a lot of interesting European crossover. It's not cool. Brubeck would be cool. Early Chico Hamilton would be cool. A lot of what was going on in contemporary was mixed between cool and cool bop. And cool bop's a word I kind of framed a year or so ago for the up-tempo West Coast stuff that was nearly hard bop, but it didn't have an emotional context. So I labeled it cool bop, and there's quite a bit of that on the West Coast. But Art Pepper is more in the cool bop camp, although he can go quite up-tempo when he wants to. Again, he had a bad drug habit from all my remembrances. But he's not well known on the East Coast by any stretch, especially to the minority communities. And likewise, the rhythm section that he's about to play with wasn't really an established West Coast rhythm section. But they were an extremely well-established rhythm section on the East Coast and even nationally because of the fact that they had worked with Miles Davis for the last couple of years. And of course, we're talking about Art Pepper meets the rhythm section. And it's on Contemporary Records. And Miles Davis' great quintet, the first one with Coltrane, Red Garland, Philly Joe Jones, and Paul Chambers, had already made Cooking Work and Seem Relaxed, and they made the Miles record in early 55. They'd gone to Columbia and had recorded a few early recordings at Columbia around midnight, and then Miles' group was starting to change and shift, and Kelly was coming into the group for Garland, and Coltrane was being dismissed for drugs. And so as that group kind of dissolves, there's changes just afoot. But they're on the West Coast playing with Miles, and it ends up being that they get booked to record a session with Art Pepper at Contemporary Records during the day because they're contractually obligated to Miles at night. And I read the liner notes just to be sure, and it's not in the liner notes. So this comes from Jean-Michel REISSUE Beethoven, my dear friend in Switzerland. And this is a story he told me numerous times. And so I'm sure it's true because his stories don't come from publications. They come from the musicians themselves because he booked most of these musicians, black and white, in Europe at jazz festivals and concerts and little tours throughout the 80s and 90s. He was a big name and was close friends with many of these guys, from Sweets Edison to Ray Brown. Like, he has quite a collection of stories that we share. He shares with me on a regular basis. And so I'm pretty sure it's him that told me this story. The session was set up. Art Pepper got wasted the night before. And from my understanding, from my remembrance, he barely showed up to the studio. I think he was late. And it wasn't like Paul and Philly Joe were good boys themselves. I don't know how bad a problem Red had. Obviously, Red had some issues because he was often late for Miles rehearsals and sessions and stuff. So he probably had a drug habit too, if not a bottle problem. I can't remember. It's hard to remember all that stuff sometimes. But certainly I know Philly Joe and Paul had big problems with heroin. But Art barely shows up. And when he does, he's kind of a mess. And I think part of the story also was that he hadn't been playing much the previous 12 months. I think he had been through a rehab program and he was back on the junk. And I just don't think he was getting much work because of his behavior. And again, I'm for sure Jean Michel will watch this and check the comments because I'm sure he'll add some details to this story that I'm saying. And like I said, anything he's ever told me, it's always been validated by other places when I've had a chance to find that story again. He's always retold things fairly accurately. So I hope he can fact check and back me up if I've misspoken here at all. But by all intents and purposes, this session should not have happened. Pepper was just a shadow of himself, and his career was kind of at a standstill because of his problems. And somehow, I don't know exactly how, but they got them into contemporary records, the rhythm section for Miles, and they record what becomes one of the coolest, most light and buoyant, cool records on the West Coast that was ever recorded. And again, like I said, it's our Pepper meets the rhythm section, and we'll give you some lovely details on this. It's on the lovely Contemporary record label, which again is one of the finest labels on the West Coast, along with Pacific Records. Those two are kind of just the giants of the indie scene. Let's not confuse them with Capitol and Decca and RCA, those giants at Columbia. These labels were bigger than Blue Note and Prestige. Probably not quite as big as Verve or Mercury, but Contemporary was definitely a well-to-do label compared to the small black East Coast labels. And so these guys showed up, waited for Art to show up. And what comes out was just a magical language. I guess they do 2 original blues numbers, which they give kind of their own personal names. I think one's like Red Blues or Red Pepper Blues. I think Red Garland and Art Pepper kind of arranged that one together. And there was another one on here called, maybe it's Jasmine Blues that Paul Chambers wrote with him. Downbeat says at the time of writing, this album was actually 1 year in release. Why it has not been reviewed until now is quite unfathomable, for it certainly was one of the best jazz albums of last year and probably Pepper's most mature recording to date. This memorable meeting deserves a favored place in anybody's collection. And that's by a guy by the name of John A. Tynan. It was not a name I'm too familiar with. So it's recorded in LA in January 1957. And by the way, that rhythm section also does a record with Sonny Rollins in, I think, 56. So these guys were still in demand, even though Miles had, them under contract for the most part. And Chambers is ubiquitous with late 50s, early 60s jazz. Even once he's working with Miles, he's still recording bass with so many cats. He shows up everywhere on hundreds of records. Garland, not so much. Garland stays much more in Red Garland's circle, and he does a lot of work as a leader, as a solo artist in trio settings, some in quintet settings, but mostly his trio records are what you want to look for. The quintet stuff is great. It's often with Donald Byrd and Coltrane, some of that stuff, but it's a very different thing than what Greg Garland does on his own. And then Philly Joe, he had a really bad drug problem as well, and he's still showing up as a sideman. He's actually recording as a leader, I think, by 59 or 58 at Riverside, where he makes 3 or 4 really outstanding records, including one at Atlantic with Elvin Jones. That's like probably from 61. That's really good as well. But these are all really in-demand session players and Miles' band, and they're really well honed together. And so I think it gives such a template and tapestry for Art Pepper to float on that he almost couldn't do wrong. And I think he showed up, put that horn to his mouth, and was just able to float and alleviate his problems. And that's the thing about jazz, is that what it does for the black man, it can do for the white man as well. Especially if you're there with sincerity and if you have some sorrows to melt away. Jazz and the blues are just an incredible place of allowing your spirit and your soul to express how you feel in the context of your experience. And the improvisation of an emotion, such a direct link to how I feel. It's such an immediate thing that few art forms can really replicate. Even most music has a real hard time being that same vehicle for how I feel. And I've said some of this before, but if you're writing a pop song or a rock song, this song might be about the woman you met 5 years ago and how beautiful she was, how much you loved her 5 years ago. It might have become a big hit. The audience might be clamoring for it. Play such and such. And so you feel obligated to play this song, but she's turned into a snake. And she cheated on you with your best friend and cost you a bunch of money. And you end up having a child with her that you're making payments to. And she's a very difficult person in your life now. Frankly, I don't like her at all. And so I'm supposed to play this song about how much I'm amazed by her, that everybody wants to hear. And so by performing it, I'm being very dishonest. The words are betraying my feelings. My feelings are no longer that. And if I had my way, I probably wouldn't even play this song anymore, but you guys need to hear it. You want to hear it because it was a big hit. And so rock and pop often have you playing from a formula that might have been sincere when you wrote it, but your point of view, your experience, your environment has changed. And now that song doesn't mean what it once meant. Jazz allows you to take whatever song you're playing, and with the freedom of improvisation from my emoting, I can express today exactly how I feel, regardless of how I felt 5 years ago. My playing can not be hindered by the construct of words. Words are very limiting. Words are very dishonest, and people find that hard to accept for me sometimes because I love words. But words are very dishonest and they've often fall very short of expressing what you're trying to say. As an artist and as a musician as well, especially, and if you're someone who lives in bondage or captivity, words have to be carefully chosen because they lynch and burn and crucify and throw men to the lions that say too controversial of words if you're an oppressed, occupied people. That can be seen as revolutionary and being very destructive to the calm and the good of society. And so you can be very restrained from expressing words. Jazz allows you to express in this code. And if you can put yourself into their place and their shoes and taking a look at their face and even look at Art Pepper's face here. He's a troubled guy. He's not a guy that's light, happy-go-lucky. He's a guy that's wearing out the jacket he's living in and probably doesn't bathe often enough. So the West Coast Cool had a lot of depth to it and sorrow at times. It could be very light and frivolous at times too, but this is just a wonderful example of the power of jazz, of people who had never played together, coming together and making a record that really stands the test of time and is an accurate depiction of West Coast Cool as I can really illustrate for you. It's not cool bop. It's not hard bop. It's not bebop. It's post most of that. It's just modern, cool, relaxed, with melodic pulse and jazz groove. You have some wonderful bowing there by the great Paul Chambers. Just the collection of songs on here it's just a fantastic nine tune set. I guess they recorded 10 songs that day, and 9 make the record. This is Imagination, Waltz Me Blues, which is probably in 3/4, Straight Life. That's as up tempo as this record gets. And that would be almost cool bop. That could be cool bop right there. That up tempo intensity. But it's not hard bop because again, hard bop has a very different anger to it that most a white player can't express that same thing as what the hard bop cats were saying. Because a hard bop is really a vehicle for the civil rights movement, and that's what people don't really understand what the context of it. It's very much a vehicle for the civil rights movement and for a militancy and a unification of Black solidarity post-war, and the promises deferred being addressed. And it's a direct link as into what happens post-civil rights. Once these guys can start saying into microphones how they feel, the sounds and messages of hard bop, the generation before, are saying those same things through their trumpets and their saxophones and what have you. And so hard bop does have a niche to it that's very succinct. And most of the great hard bop records you'll find fit in that template quite neatly. So again, cool bop needs to be a term to describe West Coast efforts and other sounds that were up tempo but lacked that aggression and that political consciousness. And sometimes that's just a feeling. Sometimes it's just what your gut's telling you. And there's a desperation, no fucking around attitude that some of the hard bop records have, that upon contemplation, you can be really kind of cognizant of and aware of it. And again, Sonny Clark's one of the great examples of that. You put Sonny Clark on a blue note, and that record's going to have a seriousness to it, a tone, a timbre that's going to be, we're not playing. This is not a game. We're seriously kind of at war here, and we got things to address. And that unity of those blue note records is just so insane if you have that empathy to kind of grasp that, the times that it was made in. And all art needs to be reflected upon the time that it's made in. It's the most important aspect to understand it. So what's interesting, though, is this record is having a reissue right now. So Craft Recordings is going to reissue a series of these great contemporary records from this great label that was run by Lester Koenig. And again, the label goes back into the early 50s with the 10-inch albums and really runs into the 70s and 80s uninterrupted. It was a very label-friendly, artist-friendly label. And there's some great titles coming, including some more Art Pepper, some Hampton Hawes. There's some digital stuff as well. But they're reissuing some of these records on vinyl. And Meets the Rhythm section is going to be one of the first that gets issued. I don't have the issue date on me. I forgot to look that up. But I know it's coming on the Craft reissue series. And so if you're looking for a great record to get to understand cool bop and the sounds that includes, and just to give you a real feeling of the West Coast wash of sound, this is a great place to start. Art Pepper Meets the Rhythm section. And again, it's three West Coast black guys meeting a cool West Coast white guy that I've never really met before. They hadn't. And it's amazing the recipe that comes out in spite of that. And in spite of him showing up late in the session, almost not happening. I think it almost got canceled, if my memory serves. So Jean-Michel, if you watch this, comment below just to kind of fill out the details that I missed on that. But for a record that almost didn't happen, it's starting to become a legacy record. And Pepper has a lot of records that you could maybe say, well, that's his legacy record. But for me, I think it's this one. It was probably the first one I came to. And it's certainly become one of the tougher Art Pepper records to find, original copies of. It's gotten very collectible and expensive. So it's a good thing Classic Records is reissuing it. So when it comes out, if it's not already out, go out and grab that. And it'll be a rewarding experience. I'm not here to talk about the details of the vinyl, and I'm sure the Craft's going to do a great job. But like I say most reissue records are going to sound fine to most people on most systems. The notion that some of the lesser pressings coming out today are going to be so inferior, unless you're sitting there actively listening for those things, which means you're not really listening to the music. If you're listening to that, if you're listening to your speakers, you're missing the music. And so I want to try to talk about some stuff that's going to be reissued coming up and help people know what to purchase. But again, we're still going to talk about the music first and foremost. So again, great record, definitely a legacy record. And if you haven't checked out that Rudimental Nina Simone song, you need to get with that. That shit's killer. It's a wonderful modern piece. Y'all be safe. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do hit that bell. Hit the thumbs up, which helps support the channel, of course. And if you want to donate a little money to the channel to help support it, there's a Patreon link in the description below. That's always appreciated. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters. You guys are fantastic. You're helping me through a tough time financially right now. I'm just not finding a lot of DJ work down here in country America. And they're looking for something I don't really have to offer. You know, I'm playing a lot of R&B, funk, hip-hop, reggae, jazz, and blues. And these people kind of want country for the most part. So I got to find my niche, and it'll come to me. It always does. But sometimes you have to just be patient. You can't force some of these things. So anyway, I'll talk to you all soon. You have a great day. Much love from the Josh Shepherd. Peace.